Hi there, and welcome to another of our major revision webinars for the 2017 exams. This one is going to focus on aspects of business costs. We make a distinction in economics between the short run and the long run. In the short run, at least one factor input is fixed. It's normally capital, can also be land, but essentially a business in the short run has fixed and variable factors. In the long run, there are no fixed factors of production. All of the inputs can be changed, and that allows the business to move to a different scale of production. A key evaluation point is that the length of time of the short run morphing into long run is going to vary by sector. If you're a local dry cleaning firm, the long run is the length of time it takes you to hire some more equipment. If you're a nuclear power industry, it can be 5, 10, 12, maybe even longer years to design, construct and bring into commission a new nuclear power station. So the short run will vary the length of time by industry. So fixed versus variable costs. Fixed costs are those costs that a business faces that don't vary as the level of production changes in the short term. Sometimes called overhead costs. Regardless of the output level in the short term, the fixed costs will remain the same, and indeed the higher the level of those fixed costs, the greater will be the output in order to break even. In contrast, variable costs are costs that relate directly to the level or the volume of production, the level of sales of a good or service. So as output goes up, so too will total variable costs. And the key exam point is that variable cost for a business is determined by the marginal cost of extra units of output. So please remember to link variable cost to marginal cost. I'm going to give you a few examples of costs, and you have to decide whether they're fixed or variable. I'll leave a few seconds for each of you to decide, and if you're on the live webinar, type your answer into the chat window. Here's the first one. The dough used by a bakery. Okay, that is likely in most people's estimation to be a variable cost. The more bread you make, the more dough you're going to use. Second example, the packaging used by an online retailer such as Amazon. Well, typically, packaging would be counted as a variable cost. The higher the level of shipping of products from warehouses and things, the increase in the cost of shipping logistics counted as a variable cost. Here's a third one. A long-term lease on a distribution or fulfillment center. Well, this is more likely to be for a business treated as a fixed cost. The picture here on the slide is actually the new Amazon distribution center in Poland. It's absolutely enormous. Land prices in Poland are very low compared to other countries in the European Union. So essentially, if you take a long-term lease, let's say, for example, you're paying £50,000 a year for 10 years to rent or to have a lease on a warehouse, then that won't change depending on the short-term level of production and how much you use it. So the key in that case is to make full use of the capacity that you have once you've taken the lease. Here's another example. The cost of acquiring a patent that lasts 15 years. Well, again, this would be a fixed cost. If you buy a patent, for example, a license to use a patented product for 10 or 15 years, and then essentially that's a fixed cost. And again, the more output you sell of a product which is patented, the lower will be the fixed cost per unit of that patent. Here's the next one. Workplace productivity software such as Google Docs or Microsoft Office. Well, this is a tricky one because it depends on the type of software that a business is using. You could almost treat it as a semi variable cost. For example, if you buy Microsoft Office for a business, then there's a cost involved, and some people would treat that as a fixed cost. Once it's been installed on people's computers, then the more that it's used, that cost doesn't change. Although, of course, you may need to get extra users to use the software. So as you add more users or more space in terms of the software or more functionality, then your cost will go up. So possibly a semi-variable cost. And what of cloud computing services, such as Dropbox and other Amazon Web Services and other examples? Well, I've put it down as a variable cost. 5 or 10 years ago, for most businesses, then they would probably have treated this as a fixed cost. The cost of setting up a cloud computing service, or the cost of setting up a server, or some kind of fixed amount of computing capacity. But of course, these days with digital technologies, there are lots of businesses now that offer you bespoke computing services. So a smaller business, as it grows online, for example, they may need more server space, more server capacity. They might need more space on Dropbox. So the cost will go up as the business expands, and therefore it becomes a variable cost. I think a key evaluation point is that these kind of digital businesses that are supplying other businesses with computing services, they are basically developing an infrastructure around cloud computing and data storage. So many of the traditional fixed costs to a business of acquiring software have essentially become variable costs. A good example is a printer, where instead of just buying the printer lock, stock and barrel, you can now rent or lease a printer and the printing ink that goes with it. It becomes a variable cost. So fixed costs are costs that don't vary with output. Here are some examples: consulting fees, big research and development projects, the fixed salary costs of your permanent workers, the cost of insurance, for example. Variable costs, well, these are costs that do depend on the level of production. Classic examples are basic raw materials, the cost of transportation, fuel and energy, packaging, and also the component parts. Typically, hourly labour, particularly workers employed on very flexible contracts, they will be counted as a variable cost, as would elements of commission pay, which are based on how much people have sold. So we've made a distinction between fixed and variable costs. Now let's do a little bit of work on calculation. The exam board have made it clear that students should be able to calculate average and total costs from given data. So let's take an example. Here's a business where output is rising in units of 50, and notice first of all that the total fixed costs remain the same. They don't change with output. Let me add in some variable costs, and these of course are the marginal cost of production, and as output goes up, variable cost is increasing. If we add together total fixed and total variable cost, we get total cost, shown in column 4. And if we divide total cost by output, then we get average total cost. And I've done the calculations there for you. Notice what's happening here to average cost as output increases. It's falling quite sharply initially, 50, 27, 19, but then the rate of decline falls away, and indeed the average cost of producing 250, 300 and 350 in this example is the same. Average cost then starts to rise initially at an output level of 400. Now marginal cost can be calculated from the change in total cost from producing an extra unit of output, and that's shown here in column 6. Keep in mind that column 1 shows that output is rising in units of 50, so we have to divide the change in total cost, which is column 4, by 50 each time to get the marginal cost of production. And marginal cost in our example falls from 10 to 4 to 3 and then starts to rise again, finishing up at 21. Now the key relationship to understand is that between average and marginal. So when the marginal cost is less than the average cost, as it is in the 5 changes from 0 to 250 here. If the marginal is less than the average cost, then average cost will fall. For the next 2 output levels, marginal cost equals average cost. And that's the case, the average cost will stay the same. And in the last example, marginal cost is above average cost. 21 is more than 14. And that causes the average cost to rise. Key exam point, marginal cost drives the average cost. Let's think about the fixed cost of the example. We know that our total fixed costs are 2,000 and they don't change as output changes. But if we want to calculate the average fixed cost, then we divide column 2 by column 1. So for example, if we produce 50 units, the fixed cost per unit is 2,000 over 50, which is 40. But if we increase output to 100, the fixed cost is still 2,000 in total, but the average fixed cost drops to 20. And you should know, hopefully, that the more you produce in the short term, if your total fixed costs are the same, the lower will be the average fixed cost. We can show this diagrammatically. The total fixed cost curve is a straight line. The average fixed cost curve is asymptotic, falling across the range of output. It will equal total fixed cost when output is 1 unit and then keep falling. This is known as spreading the overheads. Okay, so we've done some cost calculations. Let's just revise the traditional shape of short-term cost curves. A reminder in the exam, please, to label each axis accurately. Cost on the y-axis, output on the x-axis. So marginal cost falls and then rises, and the increase in marginal cost is explained by the law of diminishing marginal returns, falling marginal productivity. Marginal cost and average cost is shown in this diagram. So when marginal cost is less than average cost, the average cost will fall. And when marginal cost is above average cost, the average cost will rise. Marginal cost must cut average cost at the minimum point of the average cost curve. The examiners will be expecting you to get that right. We could also put in the average variable cost, which is variable cost divided by output. Average variable cost again tends to follow a U-shaped pattern if we have increasing and then diminishing returns in the short term. Again, marginal cost must also cut average variable cost at the minimum of the average curve. Average fixed cost is simply the difference between average total cost and average variable cost, that vertical difference shown on the diagram there. And of course that vertical difference is getting smaller because the higher the level of output, then the lower is the average fixed cost of production. So we don't actually have to draw the average fixed cost curve, we can actually see it as the gap between variable cost and average cost. And that is the main family of short-run cost curves. Here's a key diagram which is often tested in multiple choice. If a business experiences an increase in fixed costs, so research costs, the cost of patents, the costs of long-term insurance policies, for example, a change in the fixed cost of production has no effect on marginal cost. So in this example, fixed costs have gone up, AC1 shifts up to AC2, higher fixed costs, but there's no change in marginal cost, and of course no change in average variable cost. That's quite an important diagram. In contrast, if a firm's variable costs go up, then both the average and the marginal cost curve will shift up. And again, average intersects the marginal at the minimum of the average. So an increase in variable costs causes an upward shift in both marginal and average cost curves. This slide is just giving you a key summary of some of the key factors that affect short-term cost of production. The most important thing is that the supply curve is really driven by the unit cost. So typically, the factors that affect costs are things like the exchange rate, which affects the cost of imported raw materials, imported energy, imported component parts. The cost curves are affected by factors such as taxes and subsidies for businesses. So a business might be facing the effect of an increase in a carbon tax, for example, or perhaps an increase in the minimum wage they have to pay, which affects their labour costs. These things will affect short-term costs of production. Equally, a government subsidy to a producer might help to lower their costs and therefore increases their supply. The cost of regulations, meeting health and safety standards, for example, can also affect short-run costs. Key thing at the moment in the economy is the impact of the exchange rate. This is something I'll be following very closely through 2017. The pound has fallen by between 15 and 20% against the US dollar, and we're starting to see the effects showing through across many sectors of the economy, from petrol retailing to clothes retailing to petrochemicals. The fall in the pound, the depreciation of sterling, is causing import prices to go up, and that's both variable costs, for example raw materials and component parts, but also an increase in the cost of imported capital machinery. For example, computer hardware and software has become more expensive. Now we're going to do a separate webinar on economies of scale. So we're only going to touch on economies of scale briefly because it allows us to make a distinction between short-run and long-run costs. So economies of scale, of course, refers to the reduction in the unit cost of supply as a result of a business growing the scale of production. And there are many potential scale economies, ranging from big technical economies of scale from using giant containers, the cost savings from having buying power in the market, so you can achieve some bulk buy discounts on your supplies. Economies of scale can come from managerial sources, for example, employing specialised managers, specialised purchasing staff to increase productivity. Bigger businesses can often raise money more cheaply, so financial economies of scale. They can diversify into different markets. And crucially, a lot of businesses now are using network economies of scale. They know that the costs of building a network are pretty fixed and substantial, but the cost of adding one extra user to their network, to their distribution channel, is very small. So those can be quite significant economies of scale. As I say, we're going to do a special webinar on scale economies, so we'll just leave it there for the moment. The key is to understand that in the long run, the unit cost of production will change as output changes. So if businesses can benefit from increasing returns to scale, then they can move down their long run average cost curve. So moving from Q1 to Q2 would be an economy of scale. The long run average cost has fallen. Indeed, they may go further, get to Q3 and achieve something like the lowest unit cost that's feasible. This is known as productive efficiency and also the minimum efficient scale. However, if they grow too big, if they move beyond the optimum size, then average cost in the long run may start to rise, and we call that diseconomies of scale. So again, we'll have a special webinar dissecting the detail of scale economies, but the key here is that the business, as it grows in the long term, adds more unit of capital and labour and land, hopefully the unit cost comes down. That's the economies of scale. Now, what effect do economies of scale have? We'll look at the key analysis diagrams in another webinar, but essentially, if you can achieve scale economies, your output's going to be higher. Actually, your profit maximizing price is going to be lower, but your profit will be bigger. We can show that with a scale economy, if it's significant enough, the producer benefits, producer surplus is higher because supernormal profits are higher, and because price is lower and output is higher, consumer surplus also gains. So the community surplus, the combination of producer and consumer surplus, is increasing with economies of scale. Now, the extent of scale economies is a key factor determining what kind of market structure we have. So look out for the special revision webinar on scale economies. We'll make a link between the economies of scale and market structure. Okay, so those of you who are watching this on the YouTube channel, there's some key definitions that you might want to jot down. It's important to just define terms precisely and crucially make sure that you get some really good examples and get the formulas down. So there are some definitions for short-run cost. Just press the pause button if you want to jot a few definitions down. And we're going to look at this in more detail in a future webinar, but here are some key definitions of long-run costs, including the definitions of economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. All of our webinars, along with hundreds of other shorter revision videos, are available on the Tutor2You YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and type in Tutor2You and you should find our distinctive color-coordinated subject videos. I'm also on Twitter at Tutor2YouJeff, and I'm happy to field questions and provide revision support if you want to get in touch with me there. So for now, thank you for joining me on this revision webinar on costs. I hope to see you again sometime soon. Take care.